Threats, pressure, intimidation. Europe's allies are feeling the impact of President Donald Trump's growing global ambitions, even after the latest agreements on Greenland and tariffs. For Europe, open pressure from the very nation that has long been its main protector marks a historic breach of trust. The EU tried to push back, countering with its own trade bazooka. But Europe's search for new trade partners isn't going smoothly either. The Mercosur deal, celebrated just weeks ago, is now tied up in court after fierce resistance, stalled for the foreseeable future. So what are the right answers to Trump's strategy? Or is Europe simply too weak and too dependent on the United States? And to the point, we ask tariffs as a weapon. Who holds the better cards? Welcome to this week's To The Point. I'm Javier Arguedas. It's good to have you with us. Let's meet today's guests. Ulrike Herrmann is a business editor at Germany's daily Taz here in Berlin and author of several books on economic topics. Stormy-Annika Mildner is an economist and the director of the Aspen Institute in Germany. Before that, she oversaw international trade policy at the Federation of German Industries, the BDI. Melissa Eddy is the Berlin correspondent for the New York Times, where she focuses primarily on economic and business reporting. And joining us from Kiel is Professor Rolf Langhammer. He's spent many years researching international trade and globalization at the Institute for the World Economy. To all of you, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. Melissa, I'd like to start with you. We just heard about this apparent deal between NATO and the US to put an end to tensions over Greenland. What do you make of what we know so far? Is everybody happy now?
I wouldn't say everyone is happy. We are just one day after at this point. There's a lot we don't know. What we do know is that tariffs at the moment appear to be off the table. Military intervention has been taken off the table, so it is a step down. It looks like the United States could get some territorial independence of certain military bases in Greenland. There's talk of it being similar to what we see in Cyprus, and there would be access to some minerals. But there's a lot at this point that we don't know, and the Europeans will be meeting tonight to discuss what they think their next best move is.
It certainly sounds like de-escalation. Stormy, Donald Trump says consistently and constantly that America's allies need the U.S. more than the U.S. needs them. Do you think there's a limit, at least economically, to exert that power?
I would say that there is an asymmetry in our relationship. Europe certainly is very dependent on international trade. Germany is extremely dependent with a trade to a GDP ratio of around 90%. So our export markets are extremely important to us. We are also extremely invested in the United States. The markets are very interdependent. Lots of German companies are producing in the United States. Also, the financial markets are interconnected. So yes, I would say there's an interdependency, but the dependency of Europe on the US market is very high. And this also is one of the explanations why the EU agreed to a very asymmetric trade deal last summer. And we should also always not forget our huge dependency still with regard to security issues on the United States. So whenever we talk about our trade bazooka, the anti-coercion instrument, or tariffs, this also comes with costs for us because we are so dependent, and that reduces a little bit our power in exerting, or threatening countermeasures.
Certainly, that's what the Euro countries or the European Union countries are still trying to do. At least, Ulrike, do you think this new development with the de-escalation has anything to do with that threat by the European Union to impose the so-called trade bazooka?
I think that this threat was not really important, but it was also not non-important, because what somehow loomed at the horizon was a trade war. And that is what the financial markets reacted to. They didn't want to have a trade war. And for that reason, the share value of the firms in the United States started to fall. And that is something Trump reacted to immediately, because he always watches Bloomberg's, and once he sees the shares falling, he gets nervous. So in a way, indirectly, I think that this looming trade war was very important for his decision to somehow back down.
I would like to bring in Rolf in Kiel. Your institute has studied the impact of Trump's tariffs and concluded that they are mostly being paid by American consumers. Do they really work then as a political instrument to exert pressure on other countries?
I think for the time being not, because the American consumers and the American companies will see the long-term effects of the tariffs later. Maybe even later this year. So the Peterson Institute for International Economics, for instance, forecasts an inflation rate of about 4% by the end of this year. We also, of course, have estimates from Yale University telling us that the normal US households paid about $1,700. So it's a loss of real income in this direction. So the tariffs are regressive. They charge the poorer more than the richer. And that, of course, is a major burden to the US economy, not only in terms of competitiveness, but also in terms of real income loss. But the effects will take some time to really come to the surface. And we'll see when the US consumers will, of course, see disappointed and maybe give Donald Trump a yellow or even a red card when it comes to the interim elections in November.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, if I may jump in there, what's interesting to see is if you look at polling data, then you can see tariffs are pretty unpopular among the Democratic voting base. But there's still a lot of support among his own base, among the Republicans. Surprisingly so, because that should be traditionally, historically, the base being against protectionist measures. But because there has been a lot of movement in the basis of Republicans, who votes for Republicans, who votes for Democrats, we see that among Republicans there's a bigger support for protectionist measures. It's still more than 70% of the Republican base who are for it. As I said, Democrats are in their majority against it. And what's really interesting is how the independents currently view the trade policies and protectionism. And there we see that they become less popular. And that's also an interesting, voting bloc for the upcoming midterm elections. And I also think that apart from the financial markets, that Trump also had a look at what's happening internally in the United States. The Greenland issue was not very popular.
It wasn't popular at
so
all.
I think that also motivated him to
he was also losing some support within senators in his party,
yes.
And there was growing talk that Congress perhaps would actually take some action. Also, I think it was very unpopular, or we've seen from polling, it was very unpopular amongst most Americans, even amongst some in his MAGA base. So the risks for him internally were extremely high.
Maybe he was listening, but we're not entirely sure. Anyway, the tariffs feel like a punishment to other countries. And the European Union certainly is also following the same strategy, preparing its own response. Let's take a closer look at the tools the European Union has set to push back against pressure from President Donald Trump and what real leverage Europe can bring to the table when the transatlantic relationship gets tough.
Europe is the most important international market for U.S. tech giants like Google and Meta. But these companies could be most heavily affected, along with online payment service PayPal. The EU has a so-called anti-coercion instrument at its disposal, what some refer to as a trade policy bazooka. It can be used to impose penalties on services, levy counter tariffs, and exclude companies from public contracts. This is Europe's strongest weapon against economic blackmail by third countries, but it's never been used before. We will not be blackmailed, and we stand together in solidarity with Europe. We don't want escalation, we're not looking for escalation, but we are prepared for the moment if it comes. The EU Parliament is blocking the tariff deal for the time being. It was negotiated between EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Donald Trump last summer, and it includes 15% tariffs on EU goods entering the US, with 0% on US industrial products entering Europe. Since then, punitive tariffs on US goods in Europe have been suspended, from whiskey to aircrafts, amounting to 93 billion euros. but they could be reactivated. How effective are the EU's threats?
We're going to break those threats down. Ulrike, today it's Greenland. Tomorrow it could be any other ambition by President Trump in the United States. Do you think this set of measures that we just heard can somehow deter him?
Well, the problem is, and that's something Trump knows, of course, that any tariff that we impose would also damage our own economy. And right now, I think that most Germans and most Europeans would not really be ready to sacrifice their own jobs in order to somehow intervene in Greenland or, let's say, Cuba or Canada. Because I think that the feeling still is, well, Greenland is so far away and it belongs to Denmark. Why should I, as a German, suffer? And so the possibility for the EU leaders to somehow really push back is very much reduced.
That especially concerns tech giants. If we have a look at those, Melissa, they have an enormous power in the US, but also here in the EU. How smart would it be to, say, impose punitive tariffs or any other type of measures against tech giants that Europeans so heavily rely on?
Again, it's as Ulrike was saying, it's a question of weighing what are your options, because yes, that would hurt these companies and they have enormous influence over the president, as we've seen in the past year. But the question is what would the price be then for Europe, because the dependencies are so very high, especially in things like cloud computing. The Europeans would really suffer. And so it's this difficult situation for the Europeans because they've become so very dependent on the Americans, on the U.S. economy for their own existence.
Rolf, experts have long said that imposing tariffs would hurt the U.S. economy and that it could ultimately also be a punch for Donald Trump himself. You were already mentioning how studies suggest that the impact of these tariffs that have been imposed so far is still to be seen. But do you think that if we see an escalation of those tariffs, that will ultimately hurt the U.S. economy, because income from tariffs has also increased exponentially under President Trump?
Well, I think thinking that tariffs can substitute, for instance, for cuts in income taxes, I think this is wishful thinking. Normally, under normal conditions, the tariffs account for only 2% of government revenues in the US. Now, at the peak of the tariffs, which was after April 2nd, they jumped up to 8%. At the moment, we have an effective tariff of about 17%. Effective means, of course, the share of revenues from tariffs relative to the amount of imports. So this is fairly low. I would say the weakest weapon against the US are tariffs, simply because the US are not a very strong exporter of industrial goods and even agriculture. Much more effective, of course, are measures against US exports of services. And that, of course, comes then to the tech industries, where we do not have really tariffs, but we can, of course, charge and burden their turnover in Europe. And the most important weapon, we do not like to talk about very much on that because it's very costly also for Europe, is, of course, interventions in the financial markets. That means selling US treasuries by pension funds, by wealth funds, even by individuals. So this is my sequence. The weakest weapon are the tariffs. The strongest are interventions in financial markets.
Do you see Europe ready for those type of measures?
No, not for the time being.
And with regard to the tariffs, if I may jump in,
sure.
We had already seen during the first Trump administration that if certain stakeholder groups, like the agriculture sector in the United States, is hurt, then they are also going to be compensated. And that also takes a lot of pressure out of the system for President Trump. So if we believe our tariffs will create certain pressure points in the United States through an increase, for example, of inflation prices for the consumer, or less market access for certain stakeholder groups like the agriculture sector. We also need to count in or factor in that Trump might compensate those groups. And then the effect is going to be relatively low. And we already see it again, his negotiations with the agriculture sector and agriculture subsidies, but we also see it with regard to checks which might be sent to every single household to level out the effect of inflation. We also see it with his announcements. But then the US debt
would also skyrocket, probably.
That's right. That's right. And one last thing why I also believe that he might not be so impressed with our tariffs is that he has a very different thinking about trade. I mean, it's very much a zero-sum game, very mercantilistic. Exports are good, imports not so much, and so on. So if we believe that if we change his thinking about trade, that's just not going to happen.
That is, if those tariffs can be imposed in the first place. They are trying to be challenged in the courts. What do you make of that way that in which nationally they could be blocked?
You mean the tariffs in the United States?
The tariffs that Donald Trump imposed
yes,
and
absolutely, by the Supreme Court. Yeah, I mean, those tariffs, we call them the Liberation Day tariffs, right? They're implemented under a certain statute, a law from the 1970s, which allowed tariffs to be implemented under a security threat in the United States. And there is a big question if that is the case. This is why a few companies and US states went to courts and asked the courts, can you please check if there is a justification for those tariffs? And most of these courts found it isn't. So now it's at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is, well, it's going to be interesting what the result is going to be,
and what they do is they stall. They just don't talk about it because it's obvious that there is no emergency state. So there is no justification for these tariffs. But because the Supreme Court is manned by people of Trump's choice, all they can do is just not talk about it.
And it also have been talking about it, and we've already seen there was a lot of talk that the same law was going to be used to enact these tariffs over Greenland. Yep. And there was quite a bit of talk at legal levels that this was a very bad look for the Trump administration because he's trying to argue that these were not absolutely irrational and a knee-jerk reaction to something that displeased him. So that may have also played into the decision to walk back the tariff threat.
There seems really to be, we just need to, sorry for that, but we need to continue on with another important aspect because we're talking about what options the EU has. Tariffs do not seem to be the way, at least that's what I'm hearing in the consensus here on this table and back in Kiel. So the other alternative, of course, is finding new trade partners as an alternative. One thing is becoming increasingly clear for Europe. Under President Donald Trump, the United States can no longer be counted on as a reliable ally or trading partner. The search for new partners and fresh alliances is already in full swing.
A handshake in the Paraguayan capital Asunción in mid-January. The EU and participating Mercosur countries, Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay sent a message. Exchange instead of isolation. The goal is to create the world's largest free trade area covering more than 700 million people and around 20% of global trade. The EU plans to export more cars, machinery, and chemical products to South America. The reverse route is meant to be used for agricultural products like beef and soy, but also raw materials like metals and minerals. The EU Parliament has now referred the agreement to the European Court of Justice. Farmers in Europe fear cheap competition, so Brussels tightened protective clauses to obtain the necessary majority of EU member states at the last minute. Environmentalists are concerned with further destruction of rainforests. Additionally, the Mercosur countries risk remaining stuck as mere suppliers of raw materials. In Asunción, South Americans and Europeans celebrated their deal as a countermove against U.S. protectionism and the dominance under Donald Trump. How important would the agreement be for both sides?
Melissa, when we talk about the Mercosur deal negotiated for years and years, first a celebration, now it's stalled. We were talking about the importance of Europe showing unity. Germany was very much in favor. France was very much against it. It doesn't mean like European countries really mean it.
No, it definitely shows a sign of weakness and the fracturing of Europe, which is, of course, what makes it easier for Trump to get away with these different kinds of threats that he has been making, whether we're talking tariffs, whether it's the threat of military intervention in Greenland. I think we've seen this also coming from Russia, from other powers that the more fractured Europe is, the easier it is to make threats against them. And certainly the falling of the Mercosur deal, the sending it to the court, is not a good look for Europe.
What do you make of what that means for the options that Europe has to find new trade partners if we see such an important and heavily negotiated deal essentially failing?
Well, yes, it makes it harder to find new trade partners, but you should never, ever exaggerate the importance economically of these trade deals, because we have free trade in the world. For example, Germany doesn't have a trade deal with China, and nonetheless, China is one of our most important trade partners. So you can see that it is not important to have these kind of trade deals in order to have trade. This whole trade deal had a political
component.
Was a political symbol and had a political message. And of course, it is a very severe blow politically that this trade deal didn't come through.
One of the arguments is that it will make it more difficult to present the European Union as a reliable trading partner for other countries and regions. Rolf, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, says she wants to negotiate what she called a historic deal with India. Do you think that's plausible given what we're seeing with Mercosur, and how fast could it be implemented in the first place?
Well, it doesn't make the job for Ursula von der Leyen not easier after the decision of the European Parliament to send Mercosur to the courts. The Indians are rather tough, hardball playing negotiating partners for many years. And now the Indians have a lot of interest, of course, to conclude such an agreement simply because of being seen threatened first by the supremacy of China in the backyard, and on the other hand, of course, threatened by the tariffs of Donald Trump. So we look for new partners, and the EU could be one. But there's one bottleneck which is a homemade bottleneck by the EU. This is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which could, of course, make the business for Indian steel exporters and fertilizer exporters very difficult because then, of course, their production is based on coal, which, of course, is very highly carbon intensive. And that simply means that their competitiveness would suffer once the European importers would have to buy emission certificates for their imports from India. So that is a problem which now appears after the carbon adjustment mechanism has inaugurated now from the 1st of January.
It certainly has a political dimension, as Ulrike was mentioning. Stormy, do you see that link between all these signs by the EU, signing the Mercosur deal, fostering relationships with India, and Donald Trump's policies?
Well, certainly. I mean, it was already during the first Trump administration that the EU started to follow a slightly new strategy, open strategic autonomy, which also means diversification of markets and export markets, but also imports markets, having a closer look at risks within the supply chains, and also factoring in those risks a little more, looking for new partners around the world. And I would have said, I mean, it's a strong political signal because it shows that the EU is still, and some other countries around the world, in favor of rules-based open trade with clear also sustainability chapters on environmental issues, on labor issues. So that's a pretty important, strong signal. I also wanted to raise one issue, though, which we haven't talked about yet. In the, so to say, arsenal of what the EU should be doing, we should not forget our own common market. I mean, that's a huge strength for us. And not to forget that we trade about 60% of our trade among ourselves, and the barriers are humongous still. And it's in a lot of markets still a very fragmented market. So if we would get rid of these barriers, that would also give us a very big economic growth impact, and also would make us more attractive to partners outside the EU.
There are several calls that the European Union should act like one country, even though it's a union of many. But who's going to lead that transformation that the European Union needs, Melissa? Donald Trump just rejected Emmanuel Macron's calls for dialogue, saying he's not going to be in power for much longer. Who's going to be in the lead then in this bloc? Is it going to be Friedrich Merz?
Well, it should maybe be Friedrich Merz, but this is always the question with Europe, is who is going to lead Europe? We've had this question for years and years and years, and it's actually the Europeans need to decide that. And if you look at Merz, he is in one of the strongest positions of power to be able to do that.
But the art of leading Europe is to lead from behind. You could, how you do that really cleverly, you could see that with Angela Merkel. Of course, she was in charge in Europe because she was the longest ruling, and of course it was Germany. But she never, ever was on the stage somehow proclaiming what was supposed to happen. But instead, if she wanted to do something, she always asked small countries to propose her ideas.
Right.
For example,
she kept everyone together
when she wanted to have an ECB president called Lagarde, she didn't say, I want Lagarde.
Yes.
She asked some Baltic state to propose Lagarde. And that's the way how you have to govern Europe. It doesn't
Moving
work.
the strings
Yeah.
from
Which is
behind.
the opposite of how Trump governs as well, we might add.
Maybe
And
we should
how
adjust
Merz
it.
does it. You know, Merz always proposes something in public and then he's astonished that Europe doesn't follow. And that is, of course, stupid.
Certainly a dilemma. We are running out of time, as you can hear from the music. To all four of you, thank you very much for being here. And of course, to you for watching. We'll see you next week. Remember, you can always see the shows on YouTube. Just search for DW News and the latest To The Point episode. I'm Javier Arias. Take care and goodbye.